Forward of the Radio Boys on the Mexican border. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chris Thompson. The Radio Boys on the Mexican Border by Gerald Breckenridge. Forward. The development of radio telephony is still in its infancy at the time of writing in 1922. And yet it has made strides that were undreamed of in 1918. Experiments made in that year in Germany and by the Italian government in the Adriatic enabled the human voice to be projected by radio some hundreds of miles. Today, the broadcasting stations from which nightly concerts are sent far and wide across the land have tremendous range. Estimates compiled by the various American companies making and selling radiophone equipment showed that in March of 1922 there were more than 700,000 receiving sets installed throughout the country, and that installations were increasing so rapidly it was impossible to compute the percentage with any degree of accuracy, as the gains even from week to week were great. When you boys read this, the problems of control of the air will have been simplified to some extent. Yet at the beginning of 1922, they were simply chaotic. Then the United States government, of necessity, took a hand. The result will be, eventually, that certain wavelengths will be set aside for an exclusive use for amateurs, others for commercial purposes, still others for governmental use, and so on. In this connection, you will note that in the story, Jack Hampton's father builds sending stations on Long Island and in New Mexico. This is unusual and requires explanation. The tremendous growth of amateur receiving stations is due in part to the fact that such stations require no governmental license. A sending station, on the other hand, does require a license, and such license is not granted except upon good reasons being shown. It would be natural for the government, however, to give Mr. Hampton license to use a special wavelength, such as 1800 meters, for transoceanic radio experiments. Extension of the license to the New Mexico plant would follow. Signed, the author. End of Forward. Chapter 1 of The Radio Boys on the Mexican Border by Gerald Breckenridge. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 1. A Cry in the Air. Well, Bob, here we are again, and no word from Jack yet.
That's right, Frank, but the weather's been bad for sending so great a distance for days. When these spring storms come to an end, the static will lift, and we'll stand a better chance to hear from him.
Right-o, Bob. Then, too, the Hamptons may not have finished their station on time. The other shook his head.
No, Jack wrote us that they would have everything installed by the 15th, and that we should be on the lookout for his voice. And when he says he'll do a thing, he generally does it. It must be the weather. Let's step out again and have a look.
Taking off their headpieces, the two boys opened up the door of the private radiophone station where the above conversation took place, and stepped out to a little platform. It was a mild day late in June, and the sandy Long Island plain, broken only by a few trees, with the ocean in the distance, lay smiling before them. A succession of electrical storms, which for days had swept the countryside in rapid succession, apparently had come to an end. The clouds were lifting, and there was more than a promise of early sunlight to brighten the Saturday holiday. The boys looked hopefully at each other.
Looks better than it has for days, Frank.
That's right. A few moments more they chatted hopefully about the prospects, then re-entered the station. Frank Merrick and Bob Temple were chums, a little under 18 years of age each. It was their bitterest regret that they had been too young to take any part in the World War some years before. Frank was dark, curly-haired, of medium height and slim, but strong and wiry. Bob was fair and sleepy-eyed, a fraction under 6 feet tall, and weighed 180 pounds. A third chum, and the leader of the trio, was Jack Hampton, 19 years of age. He had gone to New Mexico several months before with his father, a mining engineer. All three boys were sons of wealthy parents, with country estates near the far end of Long Island. Frank's parents, in fact, were dead, and he lived with the Temples. Mr. Temple was his guardian and administrator of the large fortune left by his father, who had been Mr. Temple's partner in an exporting firm with headquarters in New York City. Jack Hampton also was motherless. The boys were keenly interested in scientific inventions, and were given every facility by Mr. Temple and Mr. Hampton for indulging their hobbies.
Such indulgence required considerable sums of money, but the men believed the boys were worth it. In fact, both gentlemen were scientifically inclined themselves, and were able to give the boys much valuable advice. When Mr. Hampton decided to go to Texas and New Mexico as the representative of a group of independent oil operators engaged in a bitter war with the oil trust known as the Octopus, Jack begged so hard to be permitted to go along that his father let him quit Harrington Hall Military Academy 2 months before the end of the term. It was agreed that when school ended June 28th, Frank and Bob should join Jack in the Southwest for their summer vacation. The two boys owned an airplane in which they hoped to make the trip when the time came. Mr. Temple, however, was dubious about letting them attempt to make so long a flight alone. "But, Dad," Bob would argue, whenever the matter was discussed, "we'll be all right. We've made lots of flights without any accidents. We're as capable as anybody. You know yourself what the instructors up at Mineola told you. You say we're too young to fly away alone. But look at the young fellows that got to be aces in the war. They're not much older than we are now." It must be confessed that Mrs. Temple thought little of the matter one way or the other. She had so many social duties to take up her time that there was little left for the boys. Accordingly, the boys had only Mr. Temple to persuade, and they felt pretty certain of doing that in time. So the last 2 months of school were spent in poring over maps and routes, and studying up on landing fields and flying conditions generally throughout the territory that they would have to cover. Much of this study for the proposed flight was carried on at the radiophone station on the Hampton estate. Mr. Hampton was an enthusiast about the development of radio telephony, and it was through him that the boys first had become interested in the subject. A year earlier he had built a powerful station for the purpose of making experiments in talking across the ocean. On that account, the United States government had granted him a special permit to use an 1,800-meter wavelength. Before leaving for the Southwest, Jack told the boys his father intended to build in Texas or New Mexico another radiophone station of similar wavelength. This would enable Mr. Hampton to communicate with his New York confreres through his Long Island station. The big thing to the boys, however, was that they would be able to talk to each other across 2,000 miles of territory. Delays in construction in the Southwest had occurred, however, and communication between the two stations had not yet been established when our story opens. As the boys re-entered the station after their inspection of the weather, Bob threw himself sprawlingly into a deep wicker chair and, picking up a book, began idly to turn the pages. Frank went to the table where the control apparatus was located and put on a headpiece. For a few moments there was silence, which Frank presently shattered with a loud cry of, "Bob! Bob, come here!" Bob dropped his book and, leaping to his feet, strode to his chum's side. "What is it?" "Put on the headpiece, Bob," said Frank in a voice of great excitement. "I believe Jack is trying to get us." Excited as his chum, Bob clamped a receiver on his head, while Frank manipulated the amplifier and detector knobs on the control apparatus. A variety of sounds greeted the boys at first, whistles, calls, and chattering coming to their ears. Then, as their tuners searched out the higher regions of the air, they shut out the sounds of the low-range air traffic. There was a thin shrieking sound. Then that also disappeared. And then, quite suddenly, the listening, expectant boys heard Jack's voice speaking to them just as plainly as if he stood in the room. "Frank, Bob, Frank," Jack was saying. "Can you hear me? Can you hear me?" "Hooray, Jack! Sure we can hear you," cried Frank, bending forward to speak into the transmitter of the stand before him. Then, as Jack's voice continued calling without paying him any attention, he straightened up and laughed. "Gee, I forgot," he laughed. Laying down his headpiece, he ran across the room, opened a door into the powerhouse adjoining where the mechanic was dozing over his pipe, and called to him to throw on the generator. Galloping back as the man obeyed, Frank again snatched up his headpiece. Bob already was bending over a transmitter, calling to Jack in faraway New Mexico. Both boys listened with straining ears for the response. Presently Jack answered. "I can hear you, but only very faintly. Put that band piece on the talking machine. You know, the one I like so much. I can't think of its name. I'll tune to it." Frank hastily shuffled through a pile of talking machine records. Finding the one he sought, he put it on the machine, which stood directly in front of a big condensing horn strapped to the back of a chair to give it the proper height. A moment or two later, Jack's voice in the receivers declared, "All right, shut her off now. I'm fixed fine." Say, Jack, think of talking 2,000 miles like this, said Bob. Oh, we've been working some days out here, answered Jack, but we couldn't get to you. No, cut in Frank. The static interfered, I guess, but it lifted today. How are things going, Jack? Bob inquired next. Jack's voice became excited. Going, he answered. Fellows, I never knew what excitement was until last week.
What do you mean?
Demanded both boys together. Oh, I couldn't tell you now, laughed Jack. It would take all day, and then some, to tell you all that's happened around here. But let me tell you, between Dad's business opponents and the gang of Mexican bandits that appeared on the scene lately, things are getting pretty lively. Say, when are you guys coming? Now's the time, if ever... Suddenly Jack's voice ceased abruptly, to be succeeded a moment later by his agonized cry for help. Then there was a crash that rang in the eardrums of the alarmed boys listening in. Then silence. Jack! Jack! They called. What's the matter? There was no answer. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of The Radio Boys on the Mexican Border by Gerald Breckenridge. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2. The Enemy Near. Frank Merrick and Bob Hampton looked at each other in alarm. Their faces were pale. That cry for help, which abruptly had cut off Jack's voice as he spoke to them from his radiophone station 2,000 miles away in New Mexico, still rang in their ears. Their heads still hummed from the vibrating crash which had succeeded. What did it all mean? Frank snatched the receiver from his head, while Bob removed his more slowly. Frank voiced the question in each mind as he said in a tone of apprehension, "What do you think happened to Jack?" "You know as much as I do," answered his chum. "Well, do you know what I think?" asked Frank with energy. "I think those Mexican bandits he spoke about sneaked up on him." "Well, if they did, they caught a Tartar," said Bob with conviction, remembering Jack's athletic prowess. All three boys were athletic, good swimmers, boxers, and wrestlers, as well as skillful fencers. Jack, however, was unquestionably the superior of the others, except that Bob was the best wrestler. Frank shook his head dubiously. "I don't know," he said. "If there was a bunch of them, and if they sneaked up from behind while he was talking." "Just the same," said Bob, "old Jack would put up some battle. I'll bet you the furniture got mussed up all right. That's the reason for that crash. Probably the microphone was torn from the cords. They may even have wrecked the station. Boy, oh boy, don't I wish I'd been there." And Bob doubled up his fists and pranced around, making deadly swings at imaginary foes. "Calm down, Bob," said Frank, dropping into a chair and running a hand through his hair as he was in the habit of doing when he was perplexed. "We don't know what happened the way we figure. We don't know what happened. Maybe Jack was badly hurt. Maybe he was killed. Or maybe he's a prisoner of the bandits." "Ugh," he cried, leaping to his feet and beginning to walk up and down the room distractedly. "Isn't there something we can do? This is maddening." "Calm yourself down, Frank," said Bob, always the cooler of the two in a crisis. "If we can't do any better, at least we can wire Jack's father to find out in a few hours what happened." At this moment the door was pushed open. A tall man of distinguished appearance, still in the prime of life and bearing a close resemblance to Bob, entered the room. He glanced inquiringly at the boys. "Something gone wrong?" he asked. "What's the trouble?" "Hello, Dad." "Hello, Uncle George." It was Mr. Temple, Bob's father and Frank's guardian, and there was relief in the boys' voices as they greeted him. He always was so capable in an emergency. "Motored home at noon today," he said. "Guess I've got spring fever. Anyhow, I couldn't stand it in the city. Della told me you were over here and that you thought perhaps you would hear from the Hamptons today." Della was Bob's younger sister and the Temples' only other child. "We heard all right, Dad," said Bob gravely. Thereupon he proceeded to relate what had occurred. Mr. Temple listened in silence. His face showed he was disturbed. At the conclusion of Bob's recital, he walked over to the headpiece and put it on. "No use, Uncle George," said Frank. But Mr. Temple turned to him with a twinkle in his eye. "That's so," he said. With a cry, Frank leapt from his chair, seized a headpiece, and put it on. "Hooray, it's Jack!" he shouted. Then he bent over to the telephone and called, "Jack! Jack, are you hurt? What happened?" "Oh, I'm bunged up a little," came Jack's voice in a cheerful tone. "But there are no bones broken." "Was it the bandits?"
demanded Bob, who had clamped on a third headpiece as he elbowed Frank aside to speak into the transmitter.
Yes, 3 of them, responded Jack. A scouting party. They sneaked in behind me. Thought I was alone, I guess. But when I hollered for help, Dad came in from the powerhouse on the run, and the pair of us put them down for the count. We've got them tied up here now. The microphone cord was snapped, but I was able to make repairs, so I started calling for you right away.
Jack, this is Mr. Temple, cut in the older man at this point. If your father's there, please put him on the phone. I'd like to speak to him.
All right, Mr. Temple, answered Jack. He's right here. Wait just a minute.
Frank and Bob politely removed their headpieces and walked to a bookcase, talking in low tones as they leaned their elbows on the top of it. This room, by the way, deserves a brief description. It was circular and without windows. The walls were hung with a material resembling burlap in appearance, but of special construction and soundproof. The ceiling was 9 feet high. From a point 6 feet up the walls, material like that in the walls stretched to a point in the middle of the ceiling. The room had somewhat the appearance of the interior of a small circus tent. This construction was for the purpose of increasing the acoustic properties. While Mr. Temple conversed with Mr. Hampton, in whose oil operations he naturally was interested, as he had invested a considerable sum in them, the boys talked in whispers. They were frankly envious of Jack's adventures, and wishing that they too were on the ground. Suddenly, something said by his father caught Bob's attention, and he stopped talking to Frank and turned to listen. Well, I'll tell you, Hampton, Bob heard his father say. I've got a sharp attack of spring fever. I think I need a vacation, and if these 2 youngsters of mine will let me go along, I'll come out with them. Bob couldn't control his eagerness. Going up to his father's side, he pulled insistently at his sleeve. Wait a minute, Hampton, said Mr. Temple. Bob has something on his mind. He removed the receiver and regarded his son with a twinkle. Out with it, he said. I suppose that, quite shamelessly, you've been listening to my conversation.
No, Dad. Honest Injun, protested Bob. I couldn't help overhearing that part about you going with us. Say, Dad, we'll go by airplane, won't we?
Mr. Temple groaned in mock dismay. Run along, he said. You'll drive me crazy with that airplane business. Then, once more adjusting his headpiece, he resumed his interrupted conversation with Mr. Hampton. Bob returned to Frank, wearing a wide grin.
I couldn't resist putting over that piece of propaganda, he said.
Do you think he'll let us fly? Whispered Frank.
Say, answered Bob scornfully, now that Dad has decided to go along, it's a cinch. He's as crazy about flying as Mr. Hampton is about the radio phone.
Psst, psst, came a warning whisper, interrupting them. They swung about to face the door into the powerhouse. It was partway open, and the round, good-natured face of Tom Barnum, filled now with anxiety, was framed in the opening. Tom was the mechanic watchman. He beckoned, and the boys tiptoed across the room and into the powerhouse, closing the door behind them. Old Davy, caretaker at the Hampton home, stood there, wringing his hands. "What is it? What's the matter?" Frank Merrick asked sharply.
"Old Davy says there's a thief up at the house," said Tom.
"A thief?" said Bob. "How do you know?"
"Seen him myself with my own 2 eyes,"
quavered old Davy, a little old man who was a pensioner of Mr. Hampton's.
"He's big, dark, ugly-looking feller. I seen him sneaking into the house through the cellar door I left open to get out some garden tools."
"Well, then what did you do?" asked Frank.
"I run," said old Davy simply. "Leastways, I tried to, but my legs ain't what they used to be."
"Come on, Bob," said Frank impulsively. "Let's go see."
"Not till we tell Dad first," said Bob, always the cooler.
Re-entering the sending room, Bob once more gained the attention of his father, who still was in conversation with Mr. Hampton. He told him what old Davy had reported. Mr. Temple readjusted the headpiece and swung about to the transmitter.
"Anything in your house a fellow could carry off in a pocket, Hampton," he said, "because the boys tell me there's a thief in it right now, and we're going to try and catch him."
"I don't think so," said Mr. Hampton, and then added in a tone of alarm. "Great guns, Temple, yes, there is. There's a duplicate list among my papers that the octopus would give anything to obtain possession of. It's a list of the lessees out here in the oil fields who have joined the independents."
"All right, Hampton," said Temple. "We're off."
Removing the headpiece, he hurried Bob back into the powerhouse. There he ordered Tom to switch off the motor, lock up, and follow them. Then, accompanied by the boys, and with old Davy trotting alongside to keep up, He started in swift strides for the Hampton house, which could be seen above the intervening treetops about a quarter of a mile away. "I thought you came out from town for a little peace and quiet, Dad," said Bob. "You're certainly getting it, aren't you? Hey, there he goes." With a shout, Bob started running swiftly toward the figure of a man who had just emerged from the open cellar door near the rear of the Hampton house. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of The Radio Boys on the Mexican Border by Gerald Breckenridge. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. A Daring Leap. At Bob's shout, the intruder who had just emerged from the Hampton cellar looked back over his shoulder. Seeing he was discovered, he broke into a desperate run. He was heading toward the front of the house where ran the long and winding drive which led to the main high road. The man shouted hoarsely, and from the front of the house came the sound of a powerful motor engine being set in motion.
"He's got a car waiting for him,"
cried Bob, who was in the lead.
"Drat the luck, he'll escape us yet." "Hey, Bob, we can cut him off at the gut,"
called Frank, and he struck away at a tangent from their course as the man disappeared around the house and the motor car could be heard roaring off down the drive.
"Righto,"
cried Bob, and he followed his chum. Old Davy had dropped far behind, and Mr. Temple and Tom Barnum were laboring along some yards in the rear of the two boys and steadily losing ground.
"Careful, boys,"
called Mr. Temple gaspingly as he grasped the meaning of the boys' maneuver.
"Don't be rash. There may be several of them." "All right, Dad," sang out Bob over his shoulder. "We'll be careful. Follow along."
The boys were heading for a place in the woods where the drive ran between 6-foot banks before turning a sharp corner. Cars perforce had to be slowed up going through this place, which the boys called the gut. Furthermore, the drive approached this place by a winding, circuitous route, while the boys were not far distant from it by the shortcut through the woods which they were following. Chances were even that they would be in time to intercept the fugitives. Yet what could they do even if they did arrive in time? They gave no thought to that as they crashed through the underbrush. Bob, slightly in the lead, reached the top of the bank overhanging the road ahead of his comrade and experienced a thrill of triumph as he heard the roar of approaching car and realized he had arrived first. The car slowed down as it entered the gut. Evidently, the driver remembered the perilous place from when he had driven through on approaching the house. The car passed below, going at a snail's pace, while Frank was still a short distance in the rear, and Mr. Temple and Tom Barnum were not yet in sight. It was an open touring car with the top folded back. There were 3 men in it, one on the seat beside the driver and the third in the rear. He was the man who had entered the Hampton house. The driver appeared to be a New York taxi chauffeur and probably had been employed for the trip. The others were swarthy men, foreign in appearance. The man beside the driver, looking up, saw Bob and shouted. At that moment, the car passed directly beneath him, and Bob leaped. He landed on the running board beside the rear seat. Steadying himself as the car lurched from the impact of his weight, Bob reached in and grasped the man on the rear seat by the coat collar and half pulled him from the car so that his body lay across the door. Then the unexpected occurred. The driver opened his throttle and the car leaped ahead, and at the same time the man beside him stood up and struck at Bob. Bob leaned back to avoid the blow, and the next moment he found himself flat on his back in the road, with the car disappearing around the curve. Frank, who by now had reached the top of the bank, dropped to the road beside him and bent over him with real anxiety in his voice as he said,
Bob, are you hurt?"
Ruefully rubbing the back of his head, Bob sat up. "No," said he, "but they got away, Frank." Again there was a crashing in the underbrush on the top of the bank, and Mr. Temple and Tom Barnum came into view, red and perspiring. "Escaped you, hey?" said Mr. Temple, leaping to the road as Bob scrambled to his feet. "But say, I see you captured something all right," and he pointed at the coat clutched fast in Bob's hand. Then for the first time Bob noticed that in falling from the car he had dragged his victim's coat with him. He held it up and looked at it curiously.
"He must have been wriggling out of his coat when he found you wouldn't let go," surmised Frank. "I could see him threshing around just as I came up to the top of the bank. Then you fell and held on tight and the coat was pulled from him."
"Yeah, I guess that's the way it happened," assented Bob. "Well, I'd rather have had the fellow. This isn't any good to me," and he tossed the coat away contemptuously.
"Not so fast, Bob," said Frank, stooping to pick up the garment. "Let's see what's in the pockets. There may be a clue as to the man's identity."
"That's right, Frank," said Mr. Temple. Search it well. And Bob, did you notice the license number of the car? We can telephone and have it intercepted."
"No," confessed Bob. "I was too busy to get that." Frank interrupted the conversation with a shout of delight. "Look at this," he cried, holding up a long strip of paper. "Return trip ticket to Ransom, New Mexico, and a wallet with a big bunch of bills in it. And here, what's this?" he added, holding up a thick, legal-looking envelope. "Why, Mr. Hampton's name is written on it."
"Let me have that, Frank," said Mr. Temple, extending his hand.
Frank passed him the envelope. Mr. Temple noted the seal had been broken, and opening it, he pulled out a thick document, down which he ran his glance hurriedly. Then his face became grave.
"Boys," he said, "Mr. Hampton has many things of value in his home, but this was the most valuable of all."
Briefly, he explained the paper contained a list of names of independents in the oil field, together with other information, which would give the Octopus a very great advantage in the business war between the Oil Trust and the independents if the document fell into its hands.
"This is pretty serious business, boys," Mr. Temple continued. "Bob, you were very rash, but you did a good stroke of business that time. Come," he added, "we'll go back to the house and call up the police. Maybe that car can be stopped and its occupants arrested."
As they turned through the woods, another thought occurred to Mr. Temple, and he asked Frank what was the name of the man to whom the railroad ticket had been issued. "Jose Morales," read Frank. "This is the portion for the return trip from New York. Evidently the man came from, why, Mr. Temple, he came here from Ransom, New Mexico. That's the nearest station on the railroad to the Hamptons' camp."
"You're right, my boy," said Mr. Temple gravely. "There is some mystery here."
Frank thwacked Bob gleefully on the back. "Say, Bob," he declared, "old Jack isn't having all the fun after all, is he?" End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of The Radio Boys on the Mexican Border by Gerald Breckenridge. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4. Shots at the Station.
"Boys,"
said Mr. Temple when the Temple home, a short distance from the Hampton place, was reached,
"come into the library with me. I want to have a serious talk with you."
Obediently, Bob and Frank filed into the room and sat down in deep leather armchairs, while Mr. Temple sat back in a swinging chair by his broad, flat-topped desk. Selecting a cigar from the humidor at his elbow, he lighted it and puffed thoughtfully several moments before addressing the chums.
"First of all," he said, at the conclusion of this period of silence, "I've decided that we will not notify the police of this affair."
"Why not, Dad?" demanded Bob in surprise.
"We want to keep this matter to ourselves until we can see more clearly what it means," explained Mr. Temple. "We recovered what was stolen, anyhow. But more than that, I begin to suspect there is something more behind all this than mere business rivalry between the independent oil operators and the trust."
"What do you mean, Uncle George?" asked Frank, puzzled.
"Well, boys, I'll tell you," said Mr. Temple, speaking deliberately and thoughtfully. "In the first place, I know the men at the head of the so-called Octopus. They are keen businessmen and quick to seize every legitimate advantage, but they are above such unscrupulous tactics as this. I know the signs point to them as the instigator of the troubles at Mr. Hampton's camp and then here today, but those signs point to something else, too. If you will recall, Jack said that the fellows who raided the Hamptons today, or tried to do so but failed, were Mexicans, and this man who entered the Hampton house today was a Mexican, too. What was his name, Frank?"
"Morales. Jose Morales," said Frank promptly.
"Yes, Jose Morales," said Mr. Temple. "Well, I believe that certain Mexicans are responsible for our troubles, and not our business rivals at all."
"What in the world?" said Bob, puzzled. "But why, Uncle George?" demanded Frank.
"In order to make trouble between the United States and Mexico," said Mr. Temple promptly.
"Oh," said Bob, "I begin to see what you're driving at. You mean, then, that by attacking the independents in the Southwest, these Mexicans would get us so stirred up that Uncle Sam would take a hand to protect our properties and might even send troops to the border?"
"That's exactly what I mean, Bob," said Mr. Temple approvingly.
"But in that case, Uncle George," demanded Frank, "why wouldn't the Mexicans be making trouble for Octopus, too?"
"Because, Frank," explained the older man, "the properties throughout the region where we are located are mainly held by independent operators. The Octopus is trying to gobble us up, but it hasn't succeeded, and it won't if we can prevent. But just the same, it isn't there for the Mexicans to attack. If they want to harass anybody in the hope of getting United States government to intervene, they must attack us and our friends and allies." Yes, I see that now, said Frank, nodding. But what makes you think that the Mexicans want to get into a war with Uncle Sam?
They don't particularly yearn to come to blows with us, Frank, said Mr. Temple, and not all Mexicans are involved, if my suspicions are correct, but only a faction. You see, boys, General Obregon has been president of Mexico now for several years, but the country is far from pacified and far from submitting to his rule. The rebel forces in the northern part of Mexico are gaining in strength right along. One of these days they will be an open revolution. Now these Mexicans who want to depose Obregon would like to get him into trouble with the United States in the hope that what they desire would then come to pass.
I begin to understand you, said Bob, with more animation than usual. You mean the rebels would like to stir up trouble on the border and get Obregon into hot water with Uncle Sam in just the same way that Pancho Villa some years ago made trouble between our government and Carranza by his raids on Columbus, New Mexico.
That's it, Bob, said his father.
Gee, Dad, cried Bob. This time, if there's war, I'm going to enlist, believe me. Same here, Uncle George, declared Frank. Bob and I could go as aviators.
Hooray for the young aviators of the Rio Grande, cried Bob, swinging his arms like a cheerleader of a high school team.
You boys don't know what you're talking about, said Mr. Temple, but with an indulgent smile. I should imagine you would have read enough of the horrors of war during the past few years to make you never want to see a battlefield or shoot a gun at a man.
That's right, Uncle George, said the sensitive Frank, shuddering as he recalled some of the things that he had read about Europe's devastation.
No, boys, said Mr. Temple, if I'm right about this, we'll have something more important to do than fight battles or track bandits across the Mexican desert by airplane.
What?
chorused the chums. Instead of making war, said Mr. Temple slowly, we'll have to prevent it.
Right-o, Uncle George, cried Frank, springing up. When do we pack?
Young man, you're in a hurry, aren't you? Smiled Mr. Temple. Well, boys, I believe that by day after tomorrow I can have my affairs in order so that I can leave them for a while. Then we'll start. That is, of course, if you'll carry me as a passenger.
Will we carry him? Said Bob, striding to his side.
Good old Dad.
And he thumped his father on the shoulder, a resounding blow that made the older man grimace humorously and draw away from him. They were interrupted by a knock on the door. Frank opened the door to find a maid standing in the passage. She was trembling with excitement.
Oh, Mr. Frank, she gasped. I heard several shots. It seemed like they came from the radiophone station of Mr. Hampton's. I'm so worried about Tom. That's right. Tom's your sweetheart, isn't he? Said Frank.
The maid blushed. Frank re-entered the room and explained the maid's message practically all in one breath. We were talking so much that we didn't hear the reports, I suppose, said Mr. Temple, jumping up and snatching his hat. The boys already were at the door, but he called them back. This time, he said grimly, I'm not going to have you taking any chances on being killed. You will wait for me, and please remember it. Opening a drawer, he drew out a heavy automatic, broke it open to assure himself it was loaded, and then dropped it in his coat pocket. All right now, he said, let's go. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of The Radio Boys on the Mexican Border by Gerald Breckenridge. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5. Plans for the Flight. The boys needed no second bidding. Out of the door, down the passageway, and out of the house they dashed. Then they headed across an intervening stretch of lawn for the radiophone station, concealed from sight by a clump of trees. Mindful of Mr. Temple's admonition not to rush into danger without him, they checked their pace, but the older man was making good time himself. Through the woods they dashed, emerging within sight of the door of the powerhouse. There stood Tom Barnum, unharmed, revolver in hand. At the noise of their approach, he swung about abruptly, bringing up his revolver in doing so. Mr. Temple and the boys shouted, and he dropped the threatening weapon again to his side. Thought they were coming back, he said. What happened, Tom? Queried Mr. Temple, as they surrounded the watchman mechanic in charge of the Hampton radiophone station, with whom they had pursued a thief fleeing from the Hampton home only a short time before. Well, sir, when we come back from chasing them fellers in the motor car, Tom explained, I stopped at your back door a minute to chin Mary and tell her the news. She wanted to know what all the excitement was about. Then I come on down here, and I thinks to myself, I'll just get out the old army revolver that I carried in France, and I'll be better fixed for trouble the next time.
So I took her out of my locker in the shop here and swabbed her up and just got everything slicked when I heard a fellow creeping up on the door and then voices whispering together. Then the door starts to open slow and easy like. I seen somebody that hadn't no business here was nosing around, and I says to myself, Tom, it's a good thing you got the old army gun fixed up in time. Then one of 'em stumbles and falls agin the door, and open she comes with him a-sprawling on the floor. The other fellow's right behind him, but he sees me and lets out a yell and turns and runs. Man, he was a regular jackrabbit, too, I'll say that for him. Well, I'd been crouching by the dynamo and let out a screech like a wild Injun and fired off a shot through the doorway, maybe 2 shots. Say, you'd ought to see that bird fly then. As for the other fellow, the one that stumbled and fell, he picks himself up and tucks out like a whitehead. I fired again, high, just to scare 'em. I scared 'em all right, I guess. Anyhow, they disappeared over south there toward that old wood road that nobody uses no more. And then I hear a motor car roar, and off she goes.
Why, cried Frank, they must have been the same 2 men we chased.
Were, said Tom, dark-looking fellers, and one didn't have no coat. That was the guy Bob peeled his coat off of. I'd know him again easy.
For several minutes there was an animated discussion of the exciting events of the afternoon. What puzzled Bob and Frank was the reason for the return of the thieves to the scene from which they had been driven. Nobody could offer a good solution of the mystery until finally Bob said, Say, I'll bet they were going to hide in here in the station and lay for me in the hope of getting back that coat and the papers the thief stole from Mr. Hampton's house. Yes, put in Frank, and the wallet with the railroad ticket to Ransom, New Mexico, and all the money, too.
I believe you're right, boys, said Mr. Temple. These certainly are no ordinary thieves, but desperate men.
Tom had re-entered the powerhouse and was pottering around the machinery. Dad, said Bob, who had been knitting his brow in thought, according to what you believe, this is all part of a plot of certain Mexicans to embroil their country and ours by making trouble for the independent operators in the Southwest represented by Mr. Hampton. In that case, why should they try so hard to steal that list of the names of the independents? That looks to me like a move on the part of your business rival, the Octopus.
I know it does, Bob, said his father. The thing isn't clear to me by a good deal, but I believe I am right. However, let's go to the station now and call up the Hamptons out in New Mexico. Both Mr. Hampton and Jack will be interested to hear about what has happened here this afternoon.
The boys agreed enthusiastically, and with a word to Tom Barnum to switch on the motor in order that they might have power to the telephone, all 3 entered the station. But despite repeated calls, they received no response. I suppose there's nobody at their station, that's all, said Bob.
I suppose so, said his father, but this business has me worried. Let's hope nothing has gone wrong out there.
Reluctantly, all 3 abandoned their efforts, removed their headpieces, and with a goodbye to Tom, who lived in a room at the rear of the station, started for the house. If New Mexico were to call, a light bulb would flash the signal in Tom's quarters, and he would telephone the house. It was twilight when they reached home, and all 3 went to their rooms to dress for dinner.
Tomorrow, said Mr. Temple, parting, we'll all drive over to church, and then in the afternoon you boys can go to work preparing the airplane, and I'll lend a hand.
Mr. Temple was chairman of the board of trustees of an old ivy-covered church in a sleepy village some miles away, and never let a Sunday pass without attending divine worship. At dinner, the talk was all of the prospective airplane flight to New Mexico. The events of the day were told in detail to Mrs. Temple and Della, Bob's sister. Della, who was an athletic girl of 16, declared she wanted to go with them, but Bob answered rudely, as boys too often speak to their sisters. Huh, he said, you just get in the way. Mrs. Temple made no objections to the proposed trip, but began immediately to lay plans for filling the house with guests during their absence, and in discussion of the details, Della was appeased. Say, Bob, why are you so rude to Della? Frank queried later in the library as they awaited Mr. Temple's coming to discuss preparations for the flight. Huh, she's not your sister, Frank, said Bob. Anyhow, I believe you're sweet on her. No, I'm not, said Frank hotly. But she's a good kid, and you ought to treat her better. Yes, you are too, said Bob. I know you, but there's no use getting hot about it. Here comes Dad now, he added, as a familiar footstep sounded in the hall. Let's get at those maps and guides, and then we'll dope this out together.
For several hours the discussion continued. For months the boys had been making their plans, going over routes, selecting landing fields, etc. Now that Mr. Temple had decided to accompany them, they laid their plans before him. He nodded, well satisfied in the main, but making a few pointed suggestions of value.
"And with the radiophone that we carry in the airplane," said Frank, "we can be in touch with Tom at this end and Jack out in New Mexico all the way. That all-metal body of the plane makes a fine ground, better than hanging wires possibly could. And with that new detector Bob and I have worked out, I'll bet we can hear all the way."
"Sure," said Bob, getting up and stretching. "Well, come on, Frank. Let's turn in. It's near midnight. I, for one, need a good night's sleep, and I hope there'll be no trouble to disturb us tonight." Alas, poor Bob could not foresee what calamity the night held in store. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of The Radio Boys on the Mexican Border by Gerald Breckenridge. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. A Thief in the Night.
"Wake up, Bob, you old sleepyhead."
Bob stirred under vigorous shaking, opened his eyes sleepily, and saw Frank bending over him. His chum had thrown a bathrobe over his pajamas. The door between their connecting rooms stood open. The early morning sunlight of a bright June day streamed in the open windows. "What's the matter?" grunted Bob, and closing his eyes he turned over and prepared to snatch an extra 40 winks. But Frank shook him again.
"Come on," said he. "Stir your stumps. We can slip out before anybody else awakes, grab something to eat in the pantry, and go down to the shed and tinker on the plane. Come on, Bob. We can get in a couple hours of work before going to church."
Bob was wide awake by now and pleased at the prospect held out by his chum. Tumbling out of bed, he headed for the shower in the bathroom, which the boys used in common, but Frank restrained him.
"Make too much noise," said Frank. "Anyhow, we can take a plunge down at the beach before going to the shed. Come on, get into some old duds and let's hurry."
The boys were dressed in short order. In the pantry, to which they tiptoed, they found cold tongue and ham, bread and butter, with which they hurriedly made several sandwiches apiece. It was not much of a breakfast, but their appetites were those of youth, and they enjoyed it. Letting themselves out the back door of the sleeping house, they started on a trot for the little private beach, a good half-mile away. The last few yards were made with the boys shedding garments as they ran. Then with a shout they plunged naked into the rollers coming in from the open Atlantic. It was great sport. For 20 minutes they crashed through the breakers, wrestled, ducked each other, shrieked aloud, secure in the knowledge that there was nobody within hearing distance, and in general had a glorious time of it. At the end of that period they rubbed down briskly with rough towels until their bodies were in a healthy glow, then dressed and set out for the airplane shed. This was located some distance back from the beach, where a long, level stretch of sandy soil, unbroken by tree or brush, made an ideal landing field. The shed, as the boys termed it, was in reality a substantial structure of corrugated iron, well anchored to resist the severe Atlantic coastal storms. It stood to one side of the route followed by the boys in going from the house to the beach, with the rear to them, and it was midway between the 2 points and concealed from the house by a clump of trees. When the matter of buying a plane was up for discussion more than a year before, after the boys and Jack Hampton, their absent chum, as well as Mr. Temple, himself an enthusiast about flying, all had become licensed pilots by taking a course at the Mineola flying fields, the question had been whether to buy a hydroplane. That question finally had to be solved by the purchase of a light, all-metal plane capable of carrying 2 passengers besides the pilot and able to alight on water and land. It was not a stock model, but was built after a special design. All 3 boys had flown it, as well as Mr. Temple, and none had ever had an accident. Equipped with a radiophone headset, to which had been added recently a detector designed by Bob and Frank to increase the receiving radius, this plane was the boys' special pride. What was their dismay, therefore, when they rounded the shed from the rear and found the great doors, which they had left padlocked several days before, standing open and the interior empty. For several moments they stood as if rooted to the ground, staring in stupefaction. Then Bob groaned, and Frank echoed him. "Gone. Gone." Frank was the first to recover from his dismay, and ran forward to look at the broken padlock dangling from one leaf of the great folding doors.
"Cut through with a file," he called excitedly to his chum. "And this set of big bar locks above and below the padlock were cut the same way. I always said we should have had one of those rolling iron screens, fitting solidly into the ends of the sidewalls and rolling up into the roof, groaned Bob, passing on into the interior. But what's the use in locking the barn after the horse is stolen? Disconsolately, he moved around the interior of the shed, as if expecting to find concealed somewhere the airplane which he could not yet bring himself to believe had been stolen. Suddenly he let out a whoop. "Frank, look at this!" "Great Scott, an iron cross!" cried Frank, seizing the object held out. A German iron cross it was. "And here, you can see how this ribbon frayed through and parted from the clasp," added Frank. "Turn it over," said Bob. "If it's a real one given by the Kaiser, it will have the recipient's name on it." Sure enough, there it was. Ober Lieutenant Friedrich von Arnheim. And beneath was inscribed, "Pour le mérite." "Great Scott, Bob," said Frank. "What do you make of this?" "Some Hun officer stole our airplane," said Bob. "That's what I make of it." "But the war is over," protested Frank. "Maybe it is," said Bob darkly. "But if that bird doesn't fly back with our airplane, I'll make war on Germany myself." Despite his gloom, Frank grinned. He slapped big Bob on the back. "Come on, old boy," he said. "No use hanging around here. We may as well go back to the house and report the latest mystery." "I wonder," said Bob as they set out, "whether there is any connection between the two, between this theft of our airplane and that stuff yesterday." It was Mr. Temple who was able to provide an answer to that question. The boys found him up and dressed when they reached home, and himself considerably excited over a telephone call from New York City. He too was dismayed when told of the theft of the airplane. But when the boys showed him the German iron cross, he hit the desk before him a resounding blow with his fist. Their conversation took place in the library. "That fits right into the puzzle," said he. "Boys, while you were out of the house, I had a long-distance telephone call from New York City. The man who called said he was a chauffeur who had driven 2 men down here yesterday, that he thought they were on legitimate business, but that when Bob tried to stop them, he saw they were bad ones, as he put it. Later, when they made him drive them over to the radiophone station, and he heard Tom rout them with his pistol shots, he said he drove off as they ran for his car and left them. He inquired in the village and learned my name, and so called me up to clear himself in case I intended starting a pursuit. And he said," added Mr. Temple, leaning forward and speaking impressively, "that he was pretty certain one man was a greaser and the other a Hun. Those were his own words. Of course, he meant one was a Mexican and the other a German." "So when this chauffeur abandoned them, they stole our airplane to get away," cried Frank, excitedly. "Exactly." "Maybe," said Bob, "I copped every cent they had in pulling that Mexican's coat off his back, and they were without car fare back to the city." "Oh, I suppose the German had money," said his father. "The German probably was an aviator, and they stole the airplane in order to escape from here quickly before we could get in pursuit of them. I imagine they'll land in some deserted spot, plenty of them in the sandy reaches along the New Jersey coast, for instance, make their way back to a railroad after abandoning the plane, and go—" "To the Southwest," said Frank emphatically, interrupting Mr. Temple. "What do you mean?" asked Bob. "Weren't there a bunch of German spies in Mexico, stirring things up there against us during the war? Well, I'll bet there are some of the same breed there now, making all this trouble for Mr. Hampton," said Frank.
"A good idea," said Mr. Temple approvingly. "Well, boys, there will be no church for us today. This matter has got to be attended to."
End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of The Radio Boys on the Mexican Border by Gerald Breckenridge. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. Kidnapped.
"Not a trace, Bob. I don't know what to make of this."
"Nor I, Frank. A fellow wouldn't believe that right here near New York, in the most densely populated part of the East, that 2 men could steal an airplane and escape without a trace."
"Oh, I don't know, Bob. You remember last winter when that aviator from the upper end of Long Island was last seen flying across the South toward the Connecticut shore and was never seen or heard of again."
"But, Frank, here 48 hours have passed. Here we are, Tuesday morning. Dad has wired every city, town, and hamlet in the East. Not a sign of the machine, nor of the men."
It was in truth Tuesday morning, the morning when, everything going as planned, they should have been setting out on their flight to the Hampton camp in New Mexico. Instead, the boys were moodily pecking at breakfast, the airplane had disappeared, and the trip seemed more and more remote. To add to their worries, they had been unable to reopen communication with their chum, Jack Hampton, by radiophone since that first and only time the previous Saturday afternoon. All their efforts to call him met with no response. The day before, moreover, a telegram had been sent Mr. Hampton by Bob Temple's father, informing him in code of recent mysterious occurrences, including the theft of the airplane, telling him the boys had tried to call Jack by radiophone, but without response from his powerful New Mexico station, and asking whether all was well with him. No answer had yet been received. "Mr. Robert," said Mary, the maid, entering the breakfast room as the two boys sat in moody silence, "your father wants you and Mr. Frank in the library." The boys hurried to the library at once, where they found Mr. Temple, very grave of face, bent above a lengthy telegram which he had just finished decoding.
"It's from Jack," he said, "and the poor fellow is in a lot of trouble. Listen," he read. "Dear friends, father has been kidnapped. 2 men in airplane carried him away into Old Mexico. Since getting your telegram a few minutes ago, realize it may have been your airplane. Wasn't there and didn't see it, but description of machine given by cowboy on the range who saw it all tallies with description of your machine." Mr. Temple paused for breath, and Frank, who had been computing mentally, interrupted.
"Our plane could do it all right," he said. "That is, if... When did this happen?"
"Monday noon, or a little later," said Mr. Temple.
"Well, they stole it sometime Saturday night," said Frank. "Yes, they wouldn't have had to make more than 80 miles an hour steady flying to do it. But where did they get the petrol?"
"Why," Bob reminded him, "we had her stocked with oil and gas, and the spare tanks filled too. That wasn't impossible."
Mr. Temple resumed. "Haven't answered your radio phone calls because didn't get them. Have been so busy running around in circles, haven't had time to watch the telephone. But if you call me when you get this, shall be on watch. Father was kidnapped Monday noon. No word from him. Need your help." "He certainly does," said Mr. Temple emphatically as he concluded reading. "And he'll get it too. Come on, boys. Let's call him up."
Evidently, Jack was on the watch for their signal, for he answered at once, and as soon as each had tuned into their private 1,800-meter wavelength, the Temples and Frank were given the full details as to the kidnapping of Mr. Hampton. He had been riding horseback across the range, miles from any oil derricks or pumping stations, on his way to visit one of the independent oil operators. A lonesome cowboy hunting a stray was the only other human being in sight, and he was half a mile away. Suddenly, out of the sky swooped an all-metal airplane, glistening in the sun. It made a beautiful landing on the sandy soil, bumped along over a few clumps of mesquite, and came to rest close beside Mr. Hampton. The latter jumped from his horse and started running toward it. Evidently, Jack thought, his father believed the Temples and Frank had unexpectedly arrived. Then the watching cowboy saw 2 men leap from the airplane and start for Mr. Hampton, who turned as if to run. Thereupon, one of the 2 pointed a revolver at him, and he turned perforce and surrendered. He was put into the plane, the 2 men again climbed aboard, and the machine soared up into the sky before the astonished cowboy could more than set his horse into motion. All this Jack explained, and then asked, "Mr. Temple, what would you advise me to do?"
"Does anyone else know of this?"
"Only the cowboy who saw it and I," said Jack. "This cowboy knew father by sight, and came direct to me with the information. I've made him promise not to tell anybody until he hears from me."
"That's right, Jack," said Mr. Temple very earnestly. "This information must not get out. I believe, Jack, your father will be safe from harm, and that the men who seized him are intent on embroiling Mexico and the United States. Now, we don't want any more wars, Jack, and we must try to get your father back without the aid of troops."
"Yes, sir," said Jack. "Father and I have suspected what the game was, and that was why I told the cowboy to say nothing."
"Good," said Mr. Temple approvingly. "Now, Jack, that the mystery of the airplane's disappearance has been cleared up, we are ready to leave at once. We can get out of the city on the 6 o'clock train tonight. Look for us Friday. I'll say goodbye until then, and let the boys speak to you, for I know they are dying to do so."
While the boys and Jack conversed, Mr. Temple sought out his wife. After explaining the necessity for his abrupt departure with the boys for New Mexico, he said,
"I should worry if I thought you would be subjected to annoyance while we were away. But I believe there will be no more trouble here, and with the servants in the house and the guests you have invited, you may feel perfectly safe."
"Oh, Dad, I think you're awfully mean not to take me along," pouted Della, who was present.
"Why, lassie," said her father, "with a bunch of harum-scarum boys to look after, my hands will be full enough."
"Yes, you think they're just boys," flashed his young daughter. "But you wait and see. They'll be taking care of you. You just wait and see. Frank is awfully clever."
"Frank," said Mr. Temple teasingly, with a meaning look. Della flushed and made an excuse to leave the room a moment later.
"I wish, George, that you wouldn't tease her about Frank," said Mrs. Temple. "She's such a child."
"Yes," said Mr. Temple thoughtfully, "I suppose so. But," he added, "I'm glad she likes Frank." End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of The Radio Boys on the Mexican Border by Gerald Breckenridge. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. Held for Ransom.
"Great Scott, Jack, how different you look. What a peach of a get-up."
The Temples, father and son, and Frank Merrick stood on the gravel bed outside the little wooden box doing duty as station at Ransom, New Mexico. The transcontinental flyer which had dropped them was dwindling in the distance. Jack Hampton, whom the chums and Mr. Temple had crossed the country from New York to join, was in the center of the group. Greetings had been exchanged. They had all slapped each other on the back indiscriminately and enthusiastically, and now Bob Temple stood off at arm's length to admire his chum. "Yes, sir. Some get-up," he added.
"Right-o," agreed Frank, also gazing at the handsome Jack admiringly. "Where did you get 'em? Lead me to the store right away."
Jack, who was 19 and the oldest of the three chums, was almost as tall as the 6-foot Bob, but of a more slender build than the gridiron warrior. He had the build of a thoroughbred, long legs, flat hips, trim waist, deep chest, and broad shoulders, and a flat back. Both at dashes and distance running, Jack easily was supreme at Harrington Hall Military Academy, which all three boys attended. Like Bob, he was fair and had curling chestnut hair. His eyes were blue and lively, his features not too regular. Altogether, he was a striking figure. Today he was dressed in khaki shirt and breeches. Instead of puttees, he wore high, laced leather boots that reached to his knees. On his head, pushed back so that his wavy hair showed in front, was a wide-brimmed sombrero. By his side, suspended from a cartridge belt, swung an automatic revolver in its holster. This was the outfit so admired by his chums from the East, trim in their lightweight summer suits of the latest cut and wearing low tan shoes more adapted for city streets than for the sand stretching inimitably on every hand.
"We've worried considerably while aboard the train, Jack," said Mr. Temple, "for fear something dire might happen to you these last 2 or 3 days. I'm glad to see you are all right. Any word from your father?"
Jack shook his head in negation. "Not a word," said he, "since those two rascals picked him up in your airplane and headed off for old Mexico."
"Well, don't worry, Jack," said Mr. Temple. "I don't believe his life is in danger."
"I'm trying not to worry, sir," said Jack. "But now that you and the fellows are here, we shall have to get busy at once. It has been pretty hard to wait for you. I wanted to ride into old Mexico myself at once." Bags in hand, the group was moving to the rear of the station, and now came in sight of a ramshackle automobile with a Mexican at the wheel, easily distinguished by his swarthy coloring and his ragged mustaches, as well as by his peculiar dress. A steep-crowned hat like a sugar loaf with a very wide brim, a tight bolero jacket that did not reach to the waist and disclosed a dark blue silken shirt beneath and tight-fitting trousers that flared at the bottom. "That is Remedios and his flivver," explained Jack. "He does odd jobs all through this region. I hired him to take us out to camp. But before we climb aboard, take a look at this view." Obediently, they paused and gazed at the surrounding country. In the foreground was a wide dirt street at the rear of the station. For the equivalent of the length of a city block, it was lined on both sides with wooden structures 1 story in height, but with the false fronts of the frontier country pretending to second stories. A front wall sticking above the roof and with the semblance of windows painted on it. A dry goods store, a Chinese laundry, an alleged hotel, several restaurants, several ex-saloons still carrying on some kind of business. These comprised the lot. At one end of the street ran abruptly into desert. At the other end was a cluster of old freight cars made into dwellings with Mexican men, women, and children loitering in front in the sun. This was Ransom.
Not much of a town, said Jack. Just a trading post for a wide stretch of this country around here. But look at the setting, will you? And he swept a hand in a wide gesture indicating the horizon. On every hand stretched the desert, broken by clumps of mesquite and cactus, with the only trees in the landscape the thick belt of cottonwoods lining the banks of a stream that rose in the mountains to the north and ran by the town. North, east, south, and west, lofty mountains gleamed on the far horizon, while closer at hand rose the foothills. These latter were of a fantastic shape, like castles, tables, or crouching animals, and of the most vivid coloring. Over all was the warm and brilliant sunshine of late afternoon. As for the air, it was clean, and despite the warmth of the day, already beginning to turn cool as the sun hovered on the rim of the farthest mountains to the west. "Some country," said Bob emphatically. "Wait till you've known it day in and day out for months," said Jack. "You will never want to go back to Long Island." "Is that how you feel about it, Jack?" asked Frank. "Oh, well, I suppose I'll want to go home sometime," said Jack. "But just the same, I'm in love with this country. As for the old timers off there in the hills, you couldn't drive them away." "Say, Jack," said Frank, as they all continued standing and gazing at the surrounding scene, "I thought we'd see some oil derricks around here, but there isn't one in sight."
"No, Frank," interposed Mr. Temple in explanation. "You see, the independents are mainly located over in the Panhandle, or upper western portion of Texas, and in Oklahoma. That is east from here. But Mr. Hampton had his geologists in through this region, and they reported the prospects for finding oil favorable. Then the independents came in quietly and took up leases, and Mr. Hampton followed to prepare for development of the field."
"Yes, that's the way of it," agreed Jack. "Say, Jack," said Frank, "I'm hungry as a hunter. If we're going to go get dinner at your camp, let's move along. How far is it, by the way?" 10 miles, said Jack, leading the way toward the automobile with its dozing Mexican at the wheel. "Come on." The others followed and were about to climb into the automobile when the rapid hoofbeats of a galloping horse ringing on the sun-baked clay of the street drew their attention, and they paused. "Why, it's Gabby Pete," said Jack in surprise, moving forward a step as the rider reined up his horse so sharply that it reared and slid on braced hind legs. The animal came to rest so close to him that Jack was forced to give back a step, and it stood there snorting and blowing. An oldish man of tremendous girth, but who sat his horse easily despite his size, grinned down at Jack. He was white-haired under the brim of his sombrero. Little eyes twinkled genially and shrewdly in a round, fat face. "What brings you here, Pete?" asked Jack sharply. "I thought you were at camp getting dinner for my guests." He indicated the boys and Mr. Temple, who stood close at hand looking on. "Who will prepare dinner for them now?" Gabby Pete, the talkative camp cook, scratched his head under his sombrero and looked solemn. "Well, they'll have to wait a bit," he said. "But I can wrestle grub up in a hurry once I get back to camp. And anyhow, Mr. Jack, a feller came to camp a while ago in one of them there aeroplanes. Just flew up almost to the door and steps out and give me this letter here." Here Gabby Pete produced a missive from the front of his shirt and passed it to Jack. "He says as how it war most particular that you get it right away. So I rid in with it," said Gabby Pete, adding aggrievedly, "and now you hop on me for it." Jack seized the missive in a sudden fever of anxiety. An airplane. He opened the letter, took in its contents at a glance, and turned excitedly to his chums. "Father's held for ransom," he cried. "Here, read this." End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of the Radio Boys on the Mexican Border by Gerald Breckenridge. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. On the Desert Trail. Eagerly, Mr. Temple, Bob, and Frank gathered around Jack, crowding to read over his shoulders the missive left at camp by a messenger in an airplane and brought to ransom by Gabby Pete, the camp cook, following Jack, who had gone to the little New Mexican town to meet the party from the east. The writing was cramped and foreign, as if the pen were wielded by a hand more accustomed to form German script than English letters. The missive was brief. "Sir, this is to inform you that Mr. John Hampton is held in a secure place. $100,000 must be paid for his release. A man riding alone must bring the money in United States bills for $1,000 each to the Calamares Ranch 2 weeks from today. He must wear a white handkerchief in his hat." While the others read, Jack turned to Gabby Pete and said authoritatively, Pete, you heard me say something just now about my father being held for ransom. I believe you are my friend?" Gabby Pete nodded violently. "Well, forget what you heard. If anybody asks you, remember that father has gone east on business."
"Sure, boy," said Pete. "I'm a tombstone. Well, me and Angel Face here." And he slapped his horse affectionately, whereat Angel Face reared and pranced, giving the lie to her name. "We may as well get started for camp so's to feed you when you arrive." Jack laid a restraining hand on Pete's knee. "Wait just a minute, Pete. Do you know where the Calamares ranch is located?" Pete nodded. "Oh, sure," he said. "That must be Don Fernandez y Calamares, down in old Mexico. That's a good 100 miles across the border. It's in a valley in them mountains," he added, pointing to the darkening southern horizon.
"And who is this Don?"
"Wall," drawled Gabby Pete plaintively, "I stick to hum so much of the time I never get to talk to nobody nor hear the news. But seems to me I did hear onct about him. Yes, sir, somebody says how Don Fernandez lives in a palace in the wilderness, just like a king of old, with armed restrainers, or whatever you calls 'em."
"Retainers, Pete," said Jack, suppressing a smile.
"Yeah, that's the word. And this feller what told me says as how he's very proud and haughty like, and he has a beautiful daughter, and
Pete dropped his voice and paused, eyeing Remedios, the Mexican in the nearby flivver.
"Think he can hear me?" he whispered.
"Guess not," said Jack. "Why?" He too looked toward Remedios. The latter had his back to them and was blowing indolent wreaths of smoke from a brown paper cigarette.
"I don't trust that feller, that's all," whispered Gabby Pete hoarsely. "He's down across the border too much of the time. Anyhow, as I was sayin', this year Don Fernandez is agin the Obregon government and backing a new revolution. That's what the feller told me anyhow. Well, Mr. Jack, Angel Face and me gonna get back and make some dinner."
And with a slap on his horse's flank that caused her to spin about and dash away, Gabby Pete was off. Jack turned to his companions. "First thing is to get to camp, I guess," he said. "Then after dinner we can talk over what has to be done. What do you say?"
"I say let's eat," said Frank plaintively.
"He's got the biggest appetite for his size I ever saw," said Bob affectionately, slapping his smaller chum on the back.
"I second Jack's motion," said Mr. Temple, seizing his bags and leading the way to the car.
The others also picked up their bags and followed.
"We know now that your father is safe, Jack," said Mr. Temple. "So the news in that note wasn't so bad after all."
"That's right," agreed Jack. "Well, climb in, fellows. Let's get started." It was a tight squeeze. Jack sat in front with Remedios in one of the bags. Mr. Temple and Bob, both big individuals, filled the rear with the balance of the bags. Frank, who had gone to the front of the car to crank it, found no room within for him when he returned. He leaped to the running board. "I'm light," he said. "I'll sit on the door. Let's go." Remedios opened the throttle, and with a rattle and a roar, the ramshackle old car darted ahead on the road taken by Gabby Pete, and soon had left the town behind and was out on the desert.
Only the upper edge of the sun stood now above the western mountains, and the purple shadows were long across the plain. In the east the sky was darkest blue, and the stars already twinkled brightly. A rosy light lingered at the zenith, while above the western mountains the sky was ruddy bright with the afterglow as the sun slipped farther and farther down and finally vanished altogether. Then night began to descend with a swiftness unknown in the east. The rattle of the car made conversation difficult, and the newcomers lapsed into silence, becoming absorbed in watching the majesty of the scene. Presently the engine began to misfire, then emitted a final groan as Remedios closed the throttle, cutting off the flow of gas, and stopped. Remedios threw the clutch into neutral, applied the brake, and climbed out. Raising the cover of the hood, he peered within. Then he shook his head dolorously.
"It's no use, senor,"
he said to Frank, who had jumped from the running board and stood beside him.
"She is finished. The spark plug, she is on the, what you call it? The bum."
And with an air of finality, he closed the cover. At the same moment, he turned to peer anxiously down the road ahead, which came now on the still twilight, the thudding hoofbeats of a galloping horse, rapidly growing louder. His mechanical instincts awake, however, Frank paid no attention to the approaching horseman. He had again lifted the cover as Remedios turned away, lighted a match in one hand, and was twisting at a spark plug with the other.
"Shucks," he cried, withdrawing his head. "That number 1 plug wasn't screwed in tightly enough, that's all. I'll bet she'll go now, just the way I tightened her by hand. If I only had a pair of pliers. At that moment, the galloping horseman dashed up alongside, pulling his horse back on his haunches. It was Gabby Pete, his hat gone, his face red with excitement. Far over he leaned to call to the astonished occupants of the car.
"Bandits," he cried hoarsely. "Greasers. Coming in an auto. I come back to warn you."
And facing about, he pointed to where a cloud of dust behind them on the desert road indicated a rapidly oncoming car. "Grab that crank," cried Frank to Remedios, and he sprang for the driving wheel. "I'll make this old bus go." "Not so fast, senor," said Remedios suavely, and seizing Frank's arm, he whirled the young fellow about. Frank looked into the muzzle of a revolver, which Remedios held leveled at him. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of The Radio Boys on the Mexican Border by Gerald Breckenridge. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10. A Brush with the Enemy. Crack, the explosion of a revolver shot. Wow! A yell of pain. Remedios seized his shooting wrist in his left hand and danced up and down in the road while his weapon fell to the ground. Frank, who a moment before had been gazing into the leveled weapon of the traitorous Mexican chauffeur, whirled about to face his friends in the car. Smoking revolver in hand, Jack Hampton stood upright in the front seat. It was he who had fired the shot. "I didn't touch him," cried Jack. "Merely shot his revolver from his hand. Jump in, Frank. Here come the bandits." With a rattle and roar, the car of the bandits approached. Not the length of 2 city blocks away, on the desert trail. Frank took in the situation at a glance. "Crank for your life," he ordered Remedios. "Jack, keep him covered." As the Mexican sprang to the crank and started turning, Frank leaped into the driver's seat of the flivver and manipulated the throttle and spark. With a clatter, the engine turned over and began to race. Closer came the bandits, their car slowing down as it approached. Jack leaned far over the windshield, his weapon leveled at Remedios. "Up on the hood," he shrieked. "Up with you, or I'll shoot you full of holes." Remedios threw himself sprawlingly over the hood. The bandit's car had slowed almost to a stop, 4 or 5 lengths away. Frank released the handbrake, pressed the clutch into low with his foot, and shot ahead. Shifting the clutch into high, Frank opened the throttle wide, and the old rattletrap seemed fairly to leap ahead, its wheels spurning the ground. The lights of the other car, which had theretofore seemed dimmed, were switched to full brightness. Before the blinding glare in his eyes, Frank involuntarily ducked his head. As his eyes left the road, the car swerved. A shot rang out from the car of the bandits, ripping high and doing no damage. "Look out, Frank! Swing her over!" cried Jack in alarm. Shouts of panic rose from the car of the bandits, too. Too late. There was a crash. The flivver lurched, then sped on. As rapidly as possible, Frank brought it to a stop and stood up to look back and view the damage. Mr. Temple and Bob in the rear seat already were on their feet. Jack stood beside Frank, peering into the shadows behind. The moon was in its first quarter, low down, and shed only a faint radiance. But even by the wan light, it could be seen that something dire had happened to the car of the bandits. It stood sideways across the road, leaning drunkenly to one side. And to the ears of the boys came groans from a number of dark figures in the road. Gabby Pete, temporarily forgotten by the boys in the excitement, galloped up, cheerful-voiced. "As neat a trick as I ever seed," he cried approvingly to Frank. "You took off the hind wheel just like a knife cutting butter. They're tumbling round in the road, a half-dozen of 'em. Hey, look out!" And Gabby Pete bent low on his horse as a bullet whistled overhead. Another and another followed, and there were shouts of vengeance and imprecations. "They are coming too," cried Gabby Pete, slapping Angel Face on the flank so that the horse leaped forward with a snort. "I'm on my way," and he disappeared into the darkness. "We're on our way too," cried Frank, opening the throttle and pressing down the clutch as more bullets whistled overhead. "Give 'em a shot, Jack, and everybody stoop down." Jack fired off his revolver, shooting high purposely. He wanted merely to frighten their pursuers into desisting. Then the car gathered momentum and was soon out of range. Presently Frank, who had been driving the flivver as fast as it would go, with the result that they were all tossed about while the car lurched precariously over the rutted road, slowed down to a more moderate pace. "Anybody hurt?" he called. "They never touched me." "Not a scratch," answered Mr. Temple. "Same here," cried Bob and Jack together. "Say, though," cried Frank, suddenly realizing Remedios was no longer sprawled on the hood, "we've lost our passenger." "Good riddance," said Bob. "We must have thrown him off when we struck the other car," decided Jack. "Or else he jumped off when his chance came," surmised Mr. Temple.
To a query from Frank as to the route to be followed and the distance to camp, Jack made answer that the road lay straight ahead with no laterals cutting into it, and that camp was only a couple of miles beyond. "Say, Jack," declared Bob with a laugh, "that was some reception committee you got out to meet us." "Yeah," kidded Frank. "What were you aiming to do, anyway? Put on a Wild West thriller for a bunch of tenderfeet fresh from New York?" Jack laughed. "Tenderfeet your grandmother," he said. "It looked to me as if the effete Easterners put on a thriller for the bandits." Relieved at the safe outcome of their adventure, everybody joined in the laugh, and for several minutes the high good humor manifested itself in jokes bandied back and forth. Then a Dobe ranch house loomed ahead, low-lying of 4 or 5 rooms, a wide dirt-floored porch along its length, upon which the rooms gave through separate doors. At the rear were a clump of shadowy outbuildings and a corral. To one side and some distance away stood a low frame building and a high latticed tower with antennae, which the chums recognized with a shout of delight. "There's the radiophone station, hey, Jack?" Frank drew the car to the porch, and Gabby Pete, at the sound of its approach, opened the door of the kitchen and emerged, big spoon in hand, the lamplight streaming from the room behind him, and savory odors floating out to the hungry boys.
"Come and get it,"
he cried sonorously.
"What does he mean, Jack?"
asked Bob. "I hope he means dinner," said Frank, sniffing hungrily. "He does," laughed Jack. "That's the way camp cooks announce food is ready in the cow camps, as I understand it. And Gabby Pete is an old cowman." "Well, lead me to it," said Frank, and all followed Jack into the house. End of chapter 10.
Chapter 11 of The Radio Boys on the Mexican Border by Gerald Breckenridge. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11. Jack Cannot Sleep.
"Well now, boys, let's see where we stand," said Mr. Temple, after all had partaken heartily, amid excited but disjointed conversation, of a surprisingly good dinner of pork and beans, boiled potatoes, fresh tomatoes and lettuce, bread pudding, and coffee. He pushed back his chair as he spoke and lighted a cigar. "First of all," he said, "we have got to consider the kidnapping of Mr. Hampton and decide what shall be done in the matter, what moves we must make. Then there's this series of mysterious happenings, all of which have a bearing on the case, if we can find the solution. Here, for instance, is this man Remedios. Evidently, he was in league with the Mexican bandits who attacked us, and it was his part of the conspiracy to stage a breakdown so that we could be attacked easily. Now, who were the bandits and what did they want? Were they ordinary robbers after money, or was their object something deeper? Was it part of this plot against our oil interests?"
He paused to puff his cigar into renewed life. All 3 chums had been listening with eager attention. Now Jack Hampton spoke. Mr. Temple earlier had elaborated for Jack's benefit his theory that a faction of Mexican rebels was responsible for the outrages of which they had been the victims, hoping thereby to embroil Mexico and the United States, and thus cause trouble for President Obregon. "Mr. Temple," said Jack, leaning forward, "I do not believe those bandits were after the money. Didn't it strike you all as strange that they were in an auto? Well, it did me. The bandits of the border usually are mounted on horseback. These men, on the contrary, had a high-powered car. No, that attack was due to a carefully laid plan. And do you know what I think their purpose was? It was to capture you." Bob and Frank, elbows planted on the table, leaned forward, surprised. Mr. Temple, however, showed no surprise, but merely looked thoughtful. "You see," continued Jack, "you are an American of wealth and position. They already have captured father. Now, if they were to capture you, there certainly would be some commotion at Washington, the national capital, that would make trouble for President Obregon of Mexico. Maybe another punitive expedition would be sent into Mexico, like General Pershing led in the time of Carranza, after Villa's raid on Columbus, New Mexico. At least, that's what they expect, I guess." Mr. Temple nodded, but remained silent. "But, Jack," demanded Frank, "if you are right in your surmise, then it means that these fellows knew in advance of our coming." "Yes," said Jack, "that's the puzzling thing about it." "Anybody here know we were coming?" asked Bob, speaking for the first time. "Sure," said Jack. "Gabby Pete knew, and Rollins, father's assistant. But you met the one, and you know he can be trusted. As for Rollins, I don't know much about him. He's a queer, silent man. Not here tonight, because they left early this morning to see a man on business over here some 20 miles or so." He said he might not return tonight, but I know Father trusted him." "Then, Jack, there is one other thing to be considered," said Bob. "And that is, has anybody among our enemies, for I suppose we can call them that, listened in when we spoke by radio?" "Of course," said Jack. "With all these amateur receiving sets in use nowadays, it is pretty hard to get absolute secrecy. But in the first place, since that Washington conference, the government has limited the use of certain wavelengths. Now we are licensed to use an 1800-meter wavelength, and I imagine there are very few, at least in this region, who could tap our conversation. In addition, of course, we used our code in discussing when you would arrive." "No, you're wrong," said Bob. "You used the code when you telegraphed that your father was kidnapped. But as I recall it, when we spoke by radio after getting your wire, we were all so excited we never thought of the code." Frank nodded in agreement.
"That's right," he said. "But anyhow, we never thought of making it a secret. Perhaps your cook, this Gabby Pete, said something innocently in town. Or the word got around somehow." "Yes, I suppose that's the way it happened," said Jack, dismissing the subject. "But the question now is, what are we going to do? Shall we telephone the county sheriff about this attack on us tonight and about Remedios? And what shall we do about Father?" Mr. Temple, who had been puffing thoughtfully throughout this discussion, his head bowed, now looked up and shook his head in negation.
"Let's not notify the sheriff," he said. "The moment we bring the authorities into this, we will run into danger of letting our whole story become known. Then the end which these mysterious enemies of ours seek will be attained. That is, the government will be drawn into the situation. As to your father, Jack," and Mr. Temple paused, "well, we shall have to think the matter over pretty carefully before we undertake to do anything. In the first place, as I have said before, I believe he was captured in order to make trouble between Mexico and the United States. Now here comes a note from his captors demanding that we pay a ransom of $100,000. How does that fit into my theory? Well, if we appeal to Washington and ask our government to demand Mr. Hampton's release, there certainly will be trouble, and that, I believe, is what the enemy counts on us to do. If they really were after a ransom and had no other object in view, it is likely that they would not have asked for so big of a sum, and also would not have given us 2 whole weeks in which to carry out their demands. No, I am convinced they expect us to go to Washington and make trouble. Therefore, that is the one thing we must try to avoid doing."
"But look here, Mr. Temple," said Jack impulsively, and with just the slightest quiver in his voice. "He's my father."
"Yes, I know, Jack," Mr. Temple said in a sympathetic tone. "And I know what you're thinking of. You're thinking your father is a prisoner and ill-treated. And you're saying to yourself that while we hold back here from appealing to the government, something dreadful may happen to him. Isn't that so?"
Jack gulped unashamedly and turned his head away. "Something like that," he said in a muffled voice. The older man dropped a hand on his shoulder.
"Don't worry too much, my boy," he said. "We may appeal to Washington and let the consequences go hang, if that is the only way to bring back your father. But we don't want to act too hastily. Let's turn in now and get a good night's sleep. Then in the morning we'll decide on something definite."
It had been a long discussion, and Bob and Frank were content to do as Mr. Temple proposed. Jack perforce agreed, although the strain of the last few days, which he had carried alone, was beginning to tell on him, and he yearned for instant action. He showed the others to their rooms, Bob and Mr. Temple sharing Mr. Hampton's room, and Frank bunking in with Jack himself. After Frank had undressed and tumbled into bed, so dog-tired, as he said, that he could barely keep his eyes open to see the way to his pillow, Jack went out to stand in the starlight on the porch. After leaning against a pillar some minutes, during which his active brain kept milling endlessly over the details of the past few days, he had an impulse to go over to the radiophone station and talk to the guard, an ex-cowboy on duty there since the attack by the 3 Mexicans at the time the story opened. Hands in pockets, head bowed in thought, he moved across the hard-packed sand, his feet making practically no sound. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of The Radio Boys on the Mexican Border by Gerald Breckenridge. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12. Jack Discovers a Traitor. 2 figures stood at the door of the radio station powerhouse. The station was a duplicate of Mr. Hampton's other station on his Long Island estate, earlier described.
So engrossed were the two men in whispered conversation that they were unaware of Jack's noiseless approach. The soft, sibilant sound of whispering which came to his ears just as he was about to approach the door roused Jack from his reflections. His suspicions were on the alert because of the happenings of recent days, and he halted. Certain, after standing a moment with every nerve tensed, that he had not been seen, Jack backed cautiously until again around the corner of the building. Who were the two men? What were they whispering about? Pressing against the side of the building, Jack thought quickly. One of the two must be a night watchman. Perhaps the other was the man who kept guard at the station by day. If he were, thought Jack, then perhaps some new danger menaced, and the night man had called the day man to help him. This theory also would account for the fact that they were whispering instead of conversing in normal tones. So probable did this supposition seem to Jack that he decided to join the men and ask what the danger was. Caution, however, prompted him to reconnoiter by peeping around the corner before stepping into the open. The next moment he was thankful he had done so, for as he looked, one of the two struck a match and held it in cupped hands to a cigarette, and Jack saw the man was Remedios. Drawing his head back quickly, Jack leaned against the building, trying to compose his thoughts. What was Remedios doing here? Not many hours before he had foiled the plan of the traitorous Mexican chauffeur to deliver him and his friends to the enemy. Was Tom, the ex-cowboy on guard at the radio plant, a traitor? Jack could not believe it. Footsteps were approaching from around the corner. Jack looked around wildly. There was no shelter near enough to which to flee. He whipped out his automatic, flung himself down alongside the wall, and waited. Two men appeared, but instead of rounding the corner, they moved straight ahead. They were in earnest but low-voiced conversation, and they did not see him. Jack stifled an exclamation. The man with Remedios was Rollins, his father's trusted assistant. So stunned was Jack at the revelation that he did not strain to overhear what they were saying. In a moment they were beyond earshot. Trembling with rage at this evidence of treachery on the part of Rollins, Jack rose to his feet. He intended to stalk the two conspirators. Then a new idea occurred to him. What were they doing at the radio plant? Perhaps for reasons of their own they had damaged it or put it out of commission. He decided to investigate. Rollins and Remedios were now out of sight toward the front of the ranch house. Perhaps Rollins would have the audacity to take the other into his room, which opened like the other rooms directly upon the porch or gallery. If so, Jack could surprise them later. First, he would investigate at the radio plant. Walking swiftly, he approached the door of the powerhouse. An electric light shone within. The guard, Tom, jumped up from a chair where he had been sitting, reading, at the sound of Jack's hurried footsteps. His hand reached for the ready revolver at his side, but was withdrawn at the sight of his visitor. "Oh, it's you, Jack," he said, addressing him familiarly, for a warm friendship had sprung up between the two. "I thought it might be a greaser." "Tom," said Jack, without any preliminaries, and showing his excitement in his voice and manner. "What was Mr. Rollins doing here? Who was that with him?" Well enough Jack knew who the stranger was, but good friend though Tom was, Jack wanted to test him. The circumstances certainly were suspicious. "I didn't see the other feller," Tom answered. "He stayed outside. Mr. Rollins said he was an oil driller. Mr. Rollins went into the station there." Tom motioned to the radio operating room beyond a closed door. "Asked me to throw on the juice so he could use the telephone." "Whom did he talk to?" "Why, I don't know," said Tom. "How would I?" "How long was he in there?" "Why, 15-20 minutes, maybe half an hour. Why, Jack, anything wrong?" "Yes, Tom, there is," said Jack. "Can I trust you?" Tom looked hurt. "That's for you to say." "Excuse me, Tom," said Jack, "but after what I've just seen, I don't know whom to trust. Yes, I believe you're true blue, Tom. I'll tell you. But wait a minute." He walked to the door and looked out. The coast was clear. "Tom," he said, returning, "I'm going to take you into my confidence. Listen." In as few words as possible, he related their adventures that day and the part played by Remedios. Then he added that in Mr. Rollins' companion he had recognized the Mexican chauffeur. "What do you make of it?" he asked. "Treachery," said Tom emphatically. "But who'd have thought it of Mr. Rollins?" They looked at each other, puzzled. "I wish I knew whom he spoke to by radio and what he said," declared Jack. "Wished I'd have listened," mourned Tom. Both stood silent. Suddenly, the still night was shattered by a series of racketing explosions.
Jack sprang for the door.
"Remedios' flivver," he cried to his companion. "There isn't another car in the world can cough like that." By the time he had emerged from the radio station, the car could be heard shooting away down the desert trail toward Ransom. "Too late," said Jack disgustedly. "He's gone. I should have surprised them together." He thought a moment and then turned to the other. "Listen, Tom," said he. "Not a word about all this. I think I'll not let Rollins know that I suspect him, but we'll talk this over first with my friends. And if he comes here to the radio again, listen to him and report to me what he says."
"All right," said the big ex-cowboy. Then as a new idea occurred to him, he asked, "But how about telling my side pard Dave? He's on duty days. He ought to know too."
"I don't know Dave as well as I do you," said Jack. "Certainly he ought to be informed so that he can be on the watch too. Can he be trusted?"
"You can count on Dave," said Tom. "We've been pardners for years now. That bow-legged son of Satan and me been through lots of ruckuses in our time. If there's any shooting to be done, count us in. You know how I can shoot."
"I ought to know," said Jack. "You taught me."
"Well, then, I'll let Dave in on the secret."
"All right," said Jack, moving away toward the house. "Good night." He started for the ranch house, but again came back. "Rollins mustn't know I was down here," he said.
"He won't know from me," Tom assured him.
When Jack reached the house, he found Mr. Temple, Bob, and Jack on the front porch in their night clothes. Rollins was there and had introduced himself. All four were discussing the disappearance of the flivver.
"You know how I sleep," said Bob, "but it made so much noise it waked even me."
"Where have you been, Jack?" asked Frank. "Why, you haven't undressed. I thought you turned in when I did. But I was so sleepy I never even noticed when I tumbled out of bed that you weren't there."
Jack felt Mr. Rollins' eyes on him. It made him uncomfortable. "Oh, I couldn't sleep," he said. "So I came out for a turn in the night air before going to bed."
"Where were you walking?"
asked Mr. Rollins quickly. Jack found lying distasteful, but decided it would not do in this case to tell the whole truth. Fortunately, on leaving the radio station, he had swung about in a circle so as to approach the house from an almost opposite direction. "Over there," said Jack, indicating the direction from which he had come. "There's a little rise some distance beyond there, but in this feeble moonlight you can't see much, so I came back. Then I heard the flivver."
"Do you think that fellow Remedios came here himself and drove it off?"
asked Frank. "He certainly had his nerve if it was he," said Bob. Jack noticed that while Rollins was watching him keenly, Mr. Temple, who had not taken part in the conversation, was studying Rollins. "Oh, it must have been Remedios," Jack said boldly. "Did anyone get close enough to see him? Who came out first? Did you notice, Mr. Rollins? You must have just arrived. I see you're still dressed."
"Yes, I put my horse up in the corral," said Rollins calmly, "and was walking over here to the house when I heard the car. I came around to see who was calling at this late hour, but all I could see was the disappearing car. Of course, I knew nothing of your day's adventures until your friends came out and we introduced ourselves and explanations followed."
End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of The Radio Boys on the Mexican Border by Gerald Breckenridge. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13. The Net is Drawn Tighter. That obvious lie on Rollins' part gave Jack the final assurance that the man was in the plot against them. Burning with indignation, he wanted to expose Rollins, but with an effort of self-control, he choked back the hot words and also managed to keep his anger from showing in his face. But it was an effort. Fortunately, the others came to his rescue. Frank began to shiver in his pajamas and called attention to the fact that the night air was chill. "Yes," said Jack, glad of the change in subject. "No matter how warm the days get out here, the nights are always cool. Let's go inside." All trooped into the living room, which was the dining room, too. In the big fireplace, they found a wood fire laid by the thoughtful Gabby Pete, ready to be touched off in the morning. The talkative camp cook slept in the bunkhouse some distance away, in the opposite direction from the radio plant, while the others dragged blankets from their beds and returned to the living room, wrapped up in them like Indians. Jack touched a match to the wood, and the fire was soon blazing merrily. Rollins would have excused himself on the plea of fatigue after a long day's ride, but Mr. Temple halted him. "So long as we're all here together," he said, "it won't hurt matters, and may help them to have a little talk." From his chair in front of the fire, Mr. Temple looked up inquiringly at Rollins, who stood to one side of the fireplace, his face in the shadows. The latter did not speak, Jack thought quickly. Was it wise for Mr. Temple, unaware of Rollins' duplicity, to discuss matters with him? He decided not. He was bending down to throw more wood on the fire, and without rising, he interposed an objection. "Mr. Rollins must be pretty tired," he said, glad his face was averted because he feared the scorn in his eyes would betray him. "And we've all had a hard day. Suppose we let the discussion go until tomorrow." Rollins spoke precipitately, and Jack believed there was a little note of relief in his voice.
"Yes," he said, "that would be better. I'm pretty tired, as Jack says. Well, I'll turn in. Good night. I'll see you at breakfast, and after that we can have our talk."
Shaking hands with Mr. Temple and throwing curt nods to Bob and Frank, Rollins left the room. A moment later, Jack rose and followed swiftly, but silently to the door on the gallery. Peering around the doorpost cautiously, he assured himself Rollins had entered his own room, and then he returned. The others looked at him in surprise, unable to understand the meaning of his actions. Jack soon enlightened them. Crouched before the fire with his eyes on the door for signs of interruption, while the others pulled their chairs close about him, Jack in a low voice outlined his experiences of the night. When he spoke of Rollins using the radio, Frank uttered an exclamation.
"That's how the enemy learned just what time we would arrive,"
he declared. Jack shook his head. "No," said he. "All Rollins had to do to spread that information was to tell Remedios. The latter could notify the men who laid for us."
"Well, then whom was he telephoning to?"
Jack again arose and moved to the door and peered out. No signs of life. He returned, and resuming his position, said in a low voice, "That's what I've been asking myself. I've thought it over, and I believe I found the answer. Either he was radioing to the Calomares ranch in Old Mexico, where my father is probably being held prisoner, or else he was sending a message to the fellows who stole our airplane." Bob the belligerent growled in his throat. "The big stiff," he muttered. "I'll go get him now and we'll choke it out of him." He half rose from his chair, but his father pushed him back. "I don't blame you, Bob," said Jack, grinning. "It's what I wanted to do myself, but I believe there's more to be gained by watching Rollins, at least until we have more to go on."
"Probably," said Frank. "If we put it up to him now, he'd be able to lie out of it."
"But he couldn't lie out of being seen with Remedios," said Bob, "or of using the radio."
"Frank is right, though," declared Jack. "Rollins would frame some alibi, and all we'd succeed in doing would be to put him on his guard."
Mr. Temple had been thinking deeply, and now he interrupted.
"Jack is probably correct in his surmise as to who Rollins was calling by radio," he said. "Probably this Calomares ranch is headquarters for the Mexican rebels who are making trouble for us. If it was the ranch that Rollins called, he may have been making his report on today's proceedings. But if he was calling the airplane, that is a more serious matter. It may mean trouble for us tonight, perhaps another attack."
"Great guns," grumbled Bob. "Don't these birds ever sleep? Well, believe me, if the hiney that stole my airplane comes around where I can get my hands on him, I'll fix him."
"You wouldn't hurt him, Bob, would you?"
said Jack. That was all Bob replied. It was enough.
"I wouldn't do a thing to him either," said Frank, "except I'd turn his Kaiser mustaches down so hard they'd never point up again."
Bob and Frank, joint owners of the airplane, grinned at each other. "Well, fellas," said Jack, "we have to go to sleep, so I propose that we stand guard turnabout tonight. It's pretty late now, midnight or thereabouts, so that if we stand 2-hour watches, the three of us will pull through nicely without spoiling Mr. Temple's slumber." The older man protested he was as able to stand watch as any of them, but the boys wouldn't have it so. Finally, it was agreed that Jack should take the first watch of 2 hours. Bob would succeed him, and Frank would have the last watch. The man keeping watch would sit inside his bedroom door opening onto the gallery, with Jack's revolver. As the bedrooms adjoined, while that of Rollins was the last in the house, it would be easy enough to guard both. The night passed, however, without incident. It had been agreed beforehand that after the expiration of Frank's watch at 6 o'clock, there would be no necessity for keeping further watch. Gabby Pete would be up and busy at his early morning tasks, and the oil drillers housed in the bunkhouse also would be stirring about. Therefore, after barring the door, a precaution Bob also had taken in the room shared with his father, he turned in without awaking Jack. Worn out by their trip of the day before, with its attack and the excitement of the night, all slept soundly, and Gabby Pete did not get them up. It was almost 10 o'clock when Jack awoke. He called to the others, and soon all were dressed and ready for what the day would bring forth.
Jack was the first dressed. He found Gabby Pete in the kitchen peeling potatoes and asked if they could have breakfast.
"Sure thing," said Gabby Pete. "Have it for you right away. Nice fresh eggs and ham and coffee. How's that?"
"Fine. Have you seen Mr. Rollins this morning?"
"Yeah. Give him breakfast early. He left word he had to go over to number 2 well, where they're still drilling and hain't struck oil yet. But said as how he'd be back later today. He took them 2 drillers from the bunkhouse with him."
"Did you know that Remedios sneaked up last night and took his flivver again? Right from under our noses?" Jack inquired.
"No, that's so?"
Gabby Pete dropped his paring knife and potatoes in surprise. "Well, he did," said Jack, starting to leave. Gabby Pete jumped up, almost upsetting his pan in his haste, and called to Jack to wait. Wiping his wet hands in a big blue apron that looked incongruous on the old cowman, he pulled open a drawer in the kitchen table and took out a flat blue envelope which he handed to Jack.
"Almost forgot this," he said. "You're telling me about that there scoundrel of a greaser put everything else out of my mind. Must be getting old and forgetful. One of these days I'll forget my head."
He would have rambled on garrulously, but Jack interrupted. He turned the envelope over curiously. It bore no address or writing of any kind, and was sealed. "What's this for, Pete?" Jack inquired.
"Oh, it's something Mr. Rollins must have dropped out of his pocket at breakfast. Found it on the floor beside his chair after he was gone. Would you give it to him?"
"All right." Jack returned to join his companions. "Have we any right to open this?" he said, after explaining how he had obtained the envelope. "I, for one, believe that we should. It may contain valuable information to us."
"You're right, Jack," said Mr. Temple. "I'm a partner in this oil enterprise, and if one of our trusted employees is a scoundrel, we are entitled to know it. Give me the envelope, and I'll take responsibility."
While the others looked on, Mr. Temple ran a knife along the edge and slit the envelope open. Inside was a mass of documents and a letter. Mr. Temple unfolded them, gave one look, then with an exclamation jumped to his feet.
"Great Scott, boys," he cried. "This is important. Luck is certainly with us."
End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of The Radio Boys on the Mexican Border by Gerald Breckenridge. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14. The Key to the Mystery. "What is it?" cried Jack, pressing forward.
Yes, tell us,
demanded Bob and Frank, as in one breath. The 3 boys crowded around Mr. Temple, who in one hand held the mass of documents and in the other the letter. He was reading the latter.
"Boys," he said, "this proves Rollins' complicity in the plot against us, but it makes matters more puzzling and complicated, too."
"How is that, sir?" Jack inquired.
"Well, first of all," said Mr. Temple, holding up the thick sheaf of papers, "this is Mr. Hampton's own original list of the leases secured by the group of independent oil operators to which I belong and which he represents here in the field."
"Is it a copy of the list I recovered from the thief who stole it from Mr. Hampton's house on Long Island?" asked Bob.
"No," smiled Mr. Temple. "It's the original. That was the copy. And this letter with it is one written by Rollins to a man in New York City who's one of the minor officials in the oil trust. It is too long to read to you, but from it I gather that Rollins is a spy in the employ of this official."
"Say, Dad," declared Bob, "this is too much for me. If the octopus is responsible for our troubles, then where do the Mexicans come in, and vice versa?"
"That's what I had in mind, Bob, when I said the discovery complicated matters," said Mr. Temple.
"Shh," warned Jack from the window toward which he was glancing at the moment. He sprang forward to see better. "Here comes Mr. Rollins now, and in a tearing hurry, too." Rollins jumped from his horse and ran along the porch to his room. They heard the door slam, and then sounds of a furious searching being carried on. The boys and Mr. Temple gathered around the door and window, looked at each other significantly.
"Found he dropped his papers and came back for them,"
whispered Frank. A moment later, Rollins called for Gabby Pete from the door of his room. The cook hurried to him from the kitchen.
"Pete, did I drop an envelope, a long blue envelope at breakfast?"
asked Rollins, making no attempt to conceal his anxiety. Before Gabby Pete could reply, Jack stepped impulsively from the doorway. "Yes, you did," he said. "Pete gave it to me to keep for you."
"Where is it?"
Rollins brusquely demanded.
"Step into my room," said Jack. Rollins complied. When he saw Mr. Temple, Bob, and Frank, he recoiled as if to flee, but Jack barred the doorway. Rollins was speechless. Mr. Temple advanced, holding out the document and the letter.
"Your duplicity is discovered, Rollins," he said. "I make no apology for having opened your sealed envelope, because last night Jack Hampton discovered you at the radio station with Remedios, and we knew you were faithless to your trust. Come, make a clean breast of it."
Rollins' face went white.
You read the letter?" he gasped.
Mr. Temple merely nodded. Rollins seemed to shrink and grow older before their eyes. Suddenly he sank into a chair. His shoulders sagged. Pressing his hands to his eyes, he bent forward and began to cry. Not the noisy crying of a child, but great, dry, wrenching sobs. "Come on, fellows," said Jack in a low voice. "Let's leave him to Mr. Temple." The older man nodded approval, and the three boys filed out, closing the door behind them. Simultaneously, each drew a long breath of relief. Bob was the first to speak. "Dad'll get it out of him," he said.
"I'm hungry,"
said Frank plaintively. At that moment, Gabby Pete poked his head from the doorway of the kitchen. Seeing the boys, he called, "Come and get it." The three started on the run for the dining room, their youthful spirits rebounding from the depressing scene in the room they had just quit in answer to the tang of a perfect day and the cook's breakfast call. Bob suddenly halted with an exclamation. "How about Dad?"
"Oh, he's too busy to miss his breakfast," said Frank. "Anyhow, we could get the cook to put up something for him."
"Yes, I'll speak to Pete about it," said Jack. "Come on." They ate hungrily with little conversation. Pete hovered near, and his presence restrained them from talking about the topic that was uppermost in their minds. "How about taking a look at the radio plant?" asked Jack when they had ended breakfast. The others agreed eagerly. They were in the act of leaving the table when Mr. Temple appeared. They crowded about him with questions.
Easy there," he protested. "I'm hungry as a hunter. Suppose you boys wait outside for me while I get a bite, and then I'll join you."
When Mr. Temple emerged, he lighted a cigar and leaned against a pillar. The boys stood about him. For several moments he was silent, staring out over the expanse of desert to the hills beyond, all shimmering beneath the heat of the summer sun.
"It's a long story," he began, "but I'll simplify it for you. Rollins held the key to the mystery. He has a family back east, an invalid wife, a son in college, a daughter just preparing to enter college. All of that takes money, for doctor's bills and school bills and clothes for the girl. Rollins was a poor man on a salary. He needed money and couldn't see his way to getting it. Then a minor official of the Octopus put temptation in his way by making him a proposition. Mind you, he wasn't one of the big men of the oil trust. I feel certain they know nothing about all this. This man proposed that Rollins obtain certain inside information about the independent oil operators and sell it to him. Rollins wanted to, but couldn't get the information. It was too closely guarded by Mr. Hampton. It was then that another temptation came Rollins' way." Mr. Temple paused. "A weak man seems to carry certain earmarks that draw scoundrels to him, boys," he said. "It was so with Rollins. At this moment, a representative of Calomares, the Mexican landowner who is backing the northern rebels, sought him out with a proposition that he betray his employers. The rebels, as I suspected, wanted to make trouble for President Obregon of Mexico by embroiling him with the United States. And the way they wanted to set about it was by raiding the independent oil operators. They needed a spy at our headquarters, and they proposed that Rollins should become their man. Then Rollins had an inspiration. He told the Mexicans that if they would help him, he would aid them. It was agreed. The agent who had acted for Calomares in the negotiations was this German, von Arnheim, an aviator and a German secret agent in Mexico during the war. He took the man Morales with him to Mr. Hampton's Long Island home to steal the duplicate list of independent leases and other data which Rollins had learned was kept there."
"That's where I came in," grinned Bob.
"Yes," said his father. "And it was because you foiled them that Rollins came into possession of Mr. Hampton's own original copy of the list and other data. For he stole it from Mr. Hampton's effects after von Arnheim and Morales had carried him away captive in our airplane."
"How about that attack on us yesterday?" asked Jack.
"As you suspected, it was for the purpose of capturing me, too," said Mr. Temple. "And Rollins had let the bandits know when I would arrive. Remedios was his go-between."
"Well," said Jack, "there's only one thing more."
"What's that?" asked Frank.
Why, I'd like to know whom Rollins radioed to last night."
"I found that out, too," said Mr. Temple. "He was talking to the Calomares Ranch in Old Mexico, which has a very powerful station, according to Rollins. He says the German, von Arnheim, told him that there are similar powerful radio stations scattered throughout Mexico and South America, all built by German money for the use of its spy system. He said this German told him the most powerful station of all was on an island in the Caribbean, and that it was so powerful it could communicate with now in Germany."
It was apparent that Mr. Temple had concluded his explanation, and Bob and Frank began to ply him with questions. Jack, however, stood silent, his face averted. Mr. Temple presently broke from the others, and laying a hand on Jack's shoulder, whirled him about.
"Your father?"
asked he, in a kindly tone. "Yes, sir."
"Well, Jack, I've got the beginnings of a plan in mind, but first I must get more information from Rollins. Then I'll talk to you again."
Jack looked him squarely in the face. "Mr. Temple," he said firmly, "I'm desperate. Father is everything in the world to me, and I'll wait to talk with you. But I'll tell you frankly, the only plan that appeals to me is to ride into Old Mexico and rescue him." The eyes of Bob and Frank, who had turned to listen, lighted up, and they nodded vigorous approval. Mr. Temple stood off and looked at the trio of husky fellows as if seeing them for the first time.
"Perhaps," said he,
"that is what you will soon be doing." End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of The Radio Boys on the Mexican Border by Gerald Breckenridge. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. To the Rescue.
"I may be wrong," said Mr. Temple thoughtfully, "in giving my sanction to this plan to rescue Mr. Hampton, but I do not believe so. And all things considered, it seems the best, if not the only, way out. I've been accustomed to regard you as mere boys, but the conduct of every one of you in our adventures lately has shown me that you are able to think and act for yourselves. Yet I don't know. Jack, you and Frank are motherless. But if anything happened to Bob, his mother would never forgive me."
"Say, Dad, forget it," grumbled the big fellow to hide his emotion. "I can take care of myself."
His father's eyes lighted approvingly as they surveyed his truly heroic frame.
"Yes, I guess you can," he said. "And you carry a cool head, too. At any rate, I've given my approval."
He smiled whimsically, then looked from one to the other of the three eager young fellows.
"My daughter Delia was right," he said. "When I left home, she said I was wrong to think of you any more as youngsters, and that the first thing I knew you would be making use of your wit and ingenuity to take care of me. And now her words are in a measure coming true."
All four were grouped around the dining room table. For several hours, plans for the rescue of Mr. Hampton had been discussed and rejected. Out of it had grown a plan which called for a daring invasion of the enemy's territory by the boys. Mr. Temple had impressed upon them the necessity for preventing the United States government from being involved in the situation. He had explained a number of angles not made clear before. Among other considerations, he said, was the fact that practically all the Central and South American republics were jealous of their big Yankee neighbor.
"If our government were to make a hostile move toward Mexico," he declared, "the other Latin republics would misconstrue our motives. They would consider that because of our size we were acting the part of the bully in order to reap financial benefit. They call us the Dollar Republic, you know. Our interests in Central and South America would suffer a severe setback."
Accordingly, it was distinctly up to the boys and Mr. Temple to effect Mr. Hampton's rescue themselves. And out of the discussion had grown the plan to have Jack, Bob, and Frank make their way to the Calomares Ranch and offer their services to the rebel forces in the guise of young Americans who were seeking adventure. Once within the rebel stronghold, they would bide their time and await an opportunity to free Mr. Hampton and escape with him.
"I, for one, won't be content until I get back our airplane," said Frank,
when the details were being discussed.
"Probably we shall be able to recapture it, and then we can all four make our escape in it. The plane carries 3 easily, and can be made to carry 4 in a pinch."
"Hooray for you!" cried Jack delightedly. "That's a real idea."
"I'll say so," declared Bob. "We can do it, too. I know we can."
Carried away by the boys' enthusiasm, Mr. Temple nodded approval. Jack said he was certain enlistment in the rebel forces would offer no difficulties. From Tom Bodine, the guard at the radio plant, with whom he had had many conversations during the past 2 months about conditions on the border, he had learned that adventurous young Americans fought frequently on one side or another in the Mexican revolutions. "I can speak Spanish pretty well, too," Jack pointed out. "And Bob and Frank have a smattering of the language, which they picked up from me." It was true. 2 years before, Jack had spent his summer vacation in Peru, where his father was engaged at the time in inspecting mining properties. Jack had learned considerable Spanish during his stay, and on his return home had continued his studies of the language. Moreover, he had aroused the interest of his chums to such an extent that they also had begun to study Spanish. Often, when by themselves, the three boys spoke to each other in the language. Spanish, by the way, is the easiest of all foreign tongues to learn, as, unlike French and Italian, all letters are sounded and the grammar is very simple. Mr. Temple was not to accompany the boys because, in the first place, his age and distinguished appearance would arouse suspicion. Young fellows riding in to enlist in the rebel forces was something that could be understood, but in his case it would be a different matter. He would stay at the ranch with Rollins, whom he decided to give another chance. Rollins knew the business details of the oil operations, and unless he were retained the work could not go on. For that reason, and also because he believed Rollins was truly repentant for his treachery and would be faithful in the future, Mr. Temple retained him. Rollins had supplied valuable information for the expedition. He gave the exact location of the Calomares ranch in the valley amid low mountains more than 100 miles to the south. There were 2 possibilities that the boys might be recognized for what they were. If Remedios should arrive at rebel headquarters, or if Von Arnheim or Morales recognized Bob as the youth who had foiled them on Long Island. Neither was very likely. Remedios, they learned from Rollins, had no intention of leaving the district, because even if the boys tried to cause his arrest, he had a mysterious political pull with the American officials, practically all of whom were of Mexican descent. As for Morales and Von Arnheim, they had only a fleeting glimpse of Bob, and he could disguise his appearance sufficiently to make that of no account.
"Well, boys," said Mr. Temple finally, "if we were all back in New York under normal conditions, I should consider this just about the craziest notion ever, and never would consent to your carrying it out. But out here, amid these changed surroundings, it seems the natural thing to do. For the life of me, I can't bring myself to feel any alarm."
"That's right, Dad," said Bob. "Don't you worry. We'll be all right."
It was now late afternoon. Tom Bodine was to escort the boys to the border as soon as darkness fell, making a big swing around Ransom so as to avoid notice, and set them on their way. They would travel by horseback, all 3 having ridden since childhood. There were a number of good mounts in the corral from which to select. The boys planned to ride the major portion of the night until they should reach a cave in the first of the Mexican foothills, where they would spend the next day in hiding. Tom Bodine knew the cave of old and was able to give the boys the location of certain landmarks which would make it easy for them to find it. The following night they would continue their journey, and this should bring them to the Calomares ranch on the morning of the second day.
"Time to get ready," said Mr. Temple, looking at his watch. "And remember, the very first thing you must try to do is get into their radio station and call me. Day or night, the men here will be watching for your signal and will call me. I'll be mighty anxious about you, so remember."
"We shall call you, sir," said Jack as the boys moved away. "And don't worry, I'm sure we'll come out all right." End of chapter 15.